The fluorescent lights of Gate 23 cast harsh shadows across David Martinez's face as airport security officers surrounded him, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. His 8-year-old daughter Emma clung to his arm, her small fingers digging into his sleeve while tears streamed down her cheeks. 20 feet away, his husband Michael stood with his hands raised, confusion and terror flickering in his eyes as a TSA agent barked commands at him to step back. "Daddy, what's happening?" Emma's voice cracked, her Spanish accent thick with fear. The word echoed through the terminal's cavernous space, bouncing off the glass walls and mixing with the mechanical hum of the air conditioning system. "It's okay, mija," David whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Everything's going to be fine." But nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine since the woman with the platinum blonde hair and the pearl necklace had pointed her manicured finger at them 15 minutes earlier. Her voice shrill as she shouted into her phone, "Yes, 911. I'm at Dallas International Airport, and there are 2 men here who have kidnapped a little girl. She's crying for help, and they won't let her go." The morning had started differently. David had woken at 5:30 in their hotel room, excitement buzzing through his chest like electricity. Their first real family vacation to Spain was finally happening. Emma had been bouncing on the hotel bed, her dark curls wild from sleep, chattering in rapid-fire English and Spanish about seeing her abuela's village for the first time. "Papi, do you think she'll teach me to make paella?" Emma had asked Michael while he zipped their suitcase shut. Michael had laughed, his green eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when Emma asked her endless questions. "I think she'll teach you everything, sweetheart. Your Spanish is already getting so good." They had been together for 12 years, married for 5, and Emma's adoptive parents for 3. The legal battle to adopt her from the foster system had been grueling, filled with paperwork and court dates and social workers who scrutinized every corner of their life. But the moment Emma had run into their arms after the final hearing, calling them both Daddy in her sweet voice, David knew every struggle had been worth it. The taxi ride to the airport had been filled with Emma's chatter about airplane food and whether she could see clouds from the window. David had held Michael's hand across the back seat, both of them grinning like teenagers as Emma pressed her face to the window, watching Dallas wake up in the early morning light. Check-in had gone smoothly. Security had been routine. They had bought Emma a coloring book and some crayons at the gift shop, found seats near their gate, and settled in to wait for their flight. Emma had curled up between them, sketching a picture of an airplane while David read emails on his phone and Michael worked on a crossword puzzle. That was when the woman had appeared. She was in her 50s, perfectly coiffed, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than David's monthly car payment. She had been sitting 3 rows away, scrolling through her phone with sharp, deliberate movements. Her eyes had landed on them once, twice, then lingered. David hadn't thought much of it initially. People stared at them sometimes. 2 men with a daughter wasn't exactly common in suburban Texas, and Emma's darker complexion contrasted with Michael's pale Irish skin in ways that prompted questions. They had learned to ignore the stares, to focus on their family and let the rest of the world figure itself out. But this woman's gaze felt different, predatory. Emma had been showing them her drawing when it happened. She had pointed to a stick figure family standing in front of a large airplane. "That's us going to Spain," she had announced proudly. "And that's you, Daddy David, and you, Daddy Michael, and that's me." David had kissed the top of her head. "It's beautiful, mija." Michael had leaned over to examine the crayon masterpiece. "I love how you drew the airplane. Those wings are perfect." Emma had beamed, launching into an explanation of all the details she had included. Her voice had carried the way children's voices do in quiet spaces, and David had noticed the woman in the navy blazer lean forward slightly, as if straining to listen. Then, Emma had switched to Spanish, the way she did when she got excited, chattering to David about something her teacher had said about airplanes. David had responded in kind, their conversation flowing naturally between languages, as it always did. The woman's expression had changed immediately. Her mouth had formed a thin line, her eyes narrowing as she studied them with renewed intensity. She had pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, then made a call. David had felt a chill run down his spine as he watched her lips move, her free hand gesturing in their direction. He had nudged Michael subtly, nodding toward the woman. "What do you think she's doing?" Michael had whispered. "I don't know, but I don't like it." They hadn't had to wonder long. Within minutes, the woman had hung up her phone and walked directly to the gate agent's counter. David had watched her lean over, speaking urgently to the uniformed woman behind the desk. Both women had turned to look at their family. Emma had been oblivious, still coloring her airplane picture, but David's chest had tightened with a familiar fear, the same fear that had haunted him through years of adoption proceedings and school enrollment meetings and doctor's appointments where people questioned their right to be Emma's parents. "Maybe we should go to the restroom," he had suggested to Michael quietly, "just in case." But it was too late. The gate agent had picked up her phone, and within seconds, David could see security personnel emerging from various corners of the terminal, all moving in their direction. The woman in the navy blazer had positioned herself strategically, phone raised, recording video as the officers approached. Her face had been twisted into an expression of righteous indignation, as if she were documenting some terrible crime instead of a family waiting for their flight. "Excuse me, sir," the lead security officer had said, his voice polite but firm. "We need to speak with you." David had stood slowly, his hand still resting on Emma's shoulder. "Is there a problem?" "We've received a report about a possible child abduction situation. We need to verify your relationship to this child." The words had hit David like a physical blow. Around them, other passengers had begun to notice the commotion. Phones appeared, pointed in their direction. The woman in the navy blazer had stepped closer, her own phone capturing every moment. "This is our daughter," Michael had said, standing as well. "We have all the documentation." "Sir, I need you to step back and keep your hands where I can see them." Another officer had interrupted. "We're going to need to separate you from the child until we can verify your identities." Emma had looked up from her coloring, confusion clouding her dark eyes. "Daddy, what's wrong?" That was when everything had fallen apart. The officers had moved quickly, professionally, but with a roughness that spoke of their perception of the threat level. One had placed his hand on David's arm, guiding him away from Emma. Another had approached Michael, speaking in low, urgent tones about cooperation and compliance. Emma had panicked. Her small voice had risen to a scream as she realized they were trying to separate her from her parents. "No, don't take them away. They're my daddies." But her cries had only seemed to confirm the officer's suspicions. Her terror, her tears, her desperate clinging to David's arm had been interpreted as evidence of trauma rather than fear of separation from the people she loved most. "It's okay, baby," David had called to her as the officers pulled him further away. "We're right here. Everything's going to be okay." The woman in the navy blazer had stepped forward then, inserting herself into the chaos with theatrical concern. "Oh, you poor little thing," she had cooed to Emma, reaching out as if to comfort her. "It's going to be all right. These nice officers are here to help." Emma had recoiled from the stranger's touch, pressing herself against the chair where David had been sitting. "I want my daddy," she had sobbed. "I want to go home." The scene had devolved quickly from there. More officers had arrived. The gate area had been cordoned off. Passengers had been moved to different locations while security conducted their investigation. Emma had been placed in the care of a child services officer who had materialized from somewhere in the airport's bureaucratic machinery. David and Michael had been separated, questioned individually in small, windowless rooms that smelled of industrial carpet and fear. David's interrogation had lasted 3 hours. The same questions repeated endlessly by different officers. "What is your relationship to the child?" "She's our adopted daughter." "Where are her adoption papers?" "In our carry-on bag. You took our bags when you detained us." "Why was she speaking Spanish?" "Because she's bilingual. We encourage her to maintain her cultural identity." The reporting party claims she was crying for help in Spanish. "She wasn't crying for help. She was excited about our trip." Round and round it went. The same questions, the same answers. While somewhere in the airport, Emma was alone with strangers, terrified and confused about why her family had been ripped apart. The breakthrough had come when the officers finally located their documentation. Emma's adoption certificate, their passports, the custody papers that established their legal parental rights. The documents were all legitimate, all in order, all clearly indicating that David Martinez and Michael O'Sullivan were the legal parents of Emma Isabella Martinez O'Sullivan. But by then, the damage was done. The airport had been partially evacuated during the initial response. Flights had been delayed. Passengers had been stranded in terminals while security swept the area. The story had already leaked to social media. Grainy cell phone videos showing a crying child being separated from 2 men who were clearly distressed. The woman in the navy blazer, whose name they learned was Karen Whitfield, had provided her own narration to the videos she posted online. "Just witnessed a kidnapping attempt at Dallas International," she had written. "2 suspicious men with a crying Hispanic child. Thank God I called 911. This could have been a trafficking situation." The videos had gone viral within hours. Airport kidnapping had trended on Twitter. News outlets had picked up the story, initially framing it as a near-miss child abduction prevented by an alert citizen. David and Michael had been released after 4 hours of detention. But Emma's trauma had been severe. She had been inconsolable when they were finally reunited, clinging to both of them and refusing to let go. Their flight to Spain had been missed, their vacation canceled, their lives suddenly turned upside down by a stranger's assumptions and prejudice. The hotel room that night had been a sanctuary of sorts, but the outside world had intruded through their phones and laptops. The story was everywhere, and the narrative was beginning to shift as more details emerged. "Dad, why did that lady call the police on us?" Emma had asked as David tucked her into bed. Her voice was small, uncertain, filled with the kind of confusion that broke his heart. David had struggled for an answer that an 8-year-old could understand without destroying her faith in the world. "Sometimes people make mistakes," he had said finally. "Sometimes they don't understand something, so they think it's scary even when it's not." "But we weren't doing anything scary. We were just going on vacation." "I know, mija, I know." Michael had joined them on the bed, wrapping both Emma and David in his arms. They had stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim light of the hotel room, while the world outside continued to spin their story in directions they couldn't control. The turning point had come the next morning when a journalist named Sarah Chen from the Dallas Morning News had done some actual reporting. She had interviewed other passengers who had been at the gate, reviewed the security footage, and uncovered the truth behind Karen Whitfield's 911 call. The article had been devastating in its clarity. Chen had obtained audio of Karen's 911 call, which revealed the real reason for her suspicions. It wasn't Emma's tears or any signs of distress. It was the fact that she had heard two men speaking Spanish with a child and assumed that something sinister was happening. "I don't think they're the real parents," Karen had told the 911 operator. "The child looks Hispanic, but the men look different, and they're speaking in foreign languages to her. It doesn't seem right." The audio had been damning. It revealed Karen's assumptions about what a real family should look like, her discomfort with hearing languages other than English, and her willingness to weaponize law enforcement against people who didn't fit her narrow worldview. Chen's investigation had also revealed Karen's background. She worked as a travel agent for an upscale agency that catered to wealthy clients. She lived in an exclusive suburb north of Dallas, and she had a history of complaints about minorities in her neighborhood, including a previous incident where she had called police on a Hispanic landscaping crew, claiming they looked suspicious. The backlash had been swift and severe. The viral videos that had initially portrayed Karen as a hero were recontextualized as evidence of racial profiling and discrimination. Airport kidnapping became your airport bigotry. The news cycle that had initially celebrated an alert citizen preventing child trafficking now focused on a family torn apart by prejudice. Karen had tried to defend herself, appearing on a local morning show to explain her actions. The interview had been a disaster, revealing her inability to acknowledge the harm she had caused or the assumptions she had made. "I was just trying to protect a child," she had insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "If you see something suspicious, you're supposed to say something." The host, a seasoned journalist named Marcus Washington, had pressed her for specifics. "What exactly did you see that was suspicious? Was the child being hurt?" "Well, no, but..." "Was she being restrained against her will?" "Not exactly, but she was crying." "Children cry in airports all the time. What made this situation different?" Karen had faltered, her carefully constructed justifications crumbling under scrutiny. It just seemed wrong. The way they looked together, the language they were speaking, it didn't add up. "So you called 911 because you didn't like the way a family looked or sounded?" That's not... I was trying to help." The interview had ended Karen's career as a travel agent. Her employer had fired her within hours, citing damage to their reputation and their commitment to serving diverse clients. Other businesses in her community had distanced themselves from her. Her social media accounts had been flooded with criticism from people around the world who had seen the footage of Emma being separated from her parents. But for David, Michael, and Emma, the public vindication hadn't immediately healed the private wounds. Emma had developed separation anxiety, crying whenever David or Michael left for work. She had stopped speaking Spanish in public, afraid that it would draw unwanted attention. Her confidence, which had been growing so beautifully since her adoption, had been shaken by the trauma of that day. The family had entered therapy together, working with a counselor who specialized in adoption and family trauma. Dr. Rodriguez had helped them process what had happened, giving them tools to rebuild Emma's sense of security and their own faith in public spaces. "What Karen did to you was wrong," Dr. Rodriguez had told Emma during one of their sessions. "But it doesn't change who you are or how much your parents love you. Emma had nodded solemnly, her small hands fidgeting with the drawing pad she always brought to their appointments. I know Daddy David and Daddy Michael love me, but why did she think they were bad people? Doctor, Rodriguez had chosen her words carefully. Sometimes adults have ideas in their heads about how things should be, and when they see something different, they get scared. But being different isn't bad. Your family is different from some families, and that makes it special. The legal battle had taken longer to resolve. David and Michael had hired Martha Santiago, one of the best civil rights attorneys in Texas, to represent them in their lawsuit against Karen and the airport authority. The case had been complex, involving claims of discrimination, emotional distress, and violation of their civil rights. Karen's legal team had tried to argue that she had acted in good faith, that her 911 call had been motivated by genuine concern for a child's welfare rather than racial prejudice. But the evidence had been overwhelming. The audio recordings, witness statements, and Karen's own social media history had painted a clear picture of someone whose actions were driven by bias rather than legitimate concern. The deposition process had been particularly revealing. Under oath, Karen had been forced to confront the assumptions she had made that day. Martha Santiago had been relentless in her questioning, exposing the underlying prejudices that had motivated Karen's actions. Ms. Whitfield, you testified that you thought the family looked suspicious. Can you explain what you meant by that? They didn't look like they belonged together. What does belonging together look like to you? I don't know. Normal families? Define normal. Karen had struggled with that question, her answers revealing the depth of her assumptions about race, family structure, and cultural identity. She had admitted to feeling uncomfortable hearing Spanish spoken in public, to making assumptions about people based on their appearance, and to believing that same-sex couples were inherently suspicious as parents. The case had settled out of court for a substantial sum, money that David and Michael had immediately placed in a trust fund for Emma's future education. But the financial settlement had been less important to them than the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the changes it had prompted at the airport. Dallas International had implemented new training protocols for security personnel, focusing on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. They had revised their procedures for handling suspected child welfare cases, requiring more evidence before separating families and ensuring that trained child advocates were involved from the beginning. Karen herself had faced additional consequences beyond the financial settlement. As part of the agreement, she had been required to complete diversity training and perform community service at a multicultural family center. She had been banned from all major airports in Texas and placed on a no-fly list maintained by several airlines. The most powerful moment had come during the public apology that was part of the settlement terms. Karen had stood before a packed courtroom, television cameras capturing every word as she read a statement acknowledging her actions and their consequences. I want to apologize to the Martinez-O'Sullivan family for the pain I caused them. She had read, her voice barely above a whisper. My actions on that day were wrong. I made assumptions based on my own prejudices, and those assumptions led me to weaponize the police against an innocent family. I caused trauma to a young child and her parents that was completely unnecessary and deeply harmful. David had watched from the plaintiff's table, holding Michael's hand while Emma sat between them. Their daughter had insisted on being present for the apology, saying she wanted to hear Karen admit she had been wrong. I have learned through this experience that my ideas about what families should look like were narrow and harmful. Karen had continued, I am committed to doing better, to examining my own biases, and to using this experience to educate others about the harm that prejudice can cause. The apology had felt hollow to David initially. Words spoken under legal compulsion couldn't undo the trauma they had experienced or restore Emma's innocence about the world's capacity for cruelty. But over time, he had come to see it as something more significant than personal vindication. The case had sparked a broader conversation about racial profiling, family diversity, and the responsibility that comes with calling law enforcement. Airports around the country had reviewed their procedures. Training programs had been developed. Other families who had experienced similar discrimination had found their voices and shared their stories. Most importantly, the support they had received from their community had been overwhelming. The videos of Emma being separated from her parents had horrified people across the political spectrum, creating a rare moment of unity around the protection of families and children. Their neighborhood had rallied around them, organizing meal trains and babysitting schedules during the legal proceedings. Emma's school had implemented new anti-bullying programs that specifically addressed family diversity. Local LGBTQ organizations had used their case to advocate for stronger legal protections for same-sex parents. A year later, they had finally taken their trip to Spain. Emma had been nervous about flying again, but Dr. Rodriguez had helped her develop coping strategies for managing her anxiety in airports. The trip had been everything they had hoped for originally and more. Emma's Spanish had blossomed during their month in Madrid and Barcelona. She had met her abuela's extended family, learned to make paella, and discovered a confidence in her cultural identity that had been shaken by Karen's actions. She had returned home bilingual, not just in language, but in culture, proud of her heritage and secure in her family's love. The media attention had gradually faded, as it always does, but the changes they had helped bring about had endured. David often received emails from other families who had faced similar situations, thanking them for standing up and fighting back against discrimination. He had spoken at conferences about adoption, civil rights, and family diversity, using their painful experience to educate others. Karen had faded from public view after completing her court-ordered community service. Her social media accounts had been deleted, her professional networks abandoned. David had occasionally wondered what had become of her, whether the experience had truly changed her perspective or simply taught her to be more careful about expressing her prejudices. He had gotten his answer 2 years after the settlement, when Karen had appeared at one of his conference presentations about family diversity. She had sat in the back row, listening as he told their story to an audience of social workers and family therapists. After his talk, she had approached him hesitantly, her appearance markedly different from the polished woman who had destroyed their vacation. She looked older, more uncertain, but also somehow more genuine. "Mr. Martinez," she had said quietly, "I don't know if you remember me, but—" "I remember you, Karen." She had flinched at the use of her name, as if hearing it from him carried special weight. "I wanted to tell you that I've been volunteering at the Multicultural Center for 2 years now. Not because I have to anymore, but because I want to." David had studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. But what he saw instead was genuine regret and what appeared to be real growth. "I work with families like yours now," she had continued. "I help them navigate systems that aren't always welcoming. And every day, I think about Emma and what I did to her. I can't undo it, but I'm trying to prevent it from happening to other children." They had talked for 20 minutes, a conversation that felt surreal given their history. Karen had told him about the training program she had developed, the sensitivity workshops she now facilitated, the families she had helped avoid the kind of discrimination she had once perpetrated. "I don't expect forgiveness," she had said as their conversation wound down. "I just wanted you to know that what happened to your family changed me. really changed me, and I'm trying to use that change to do better. David had driven home that night, thinking about redemption and growth, about whether people could truly change their fundamental attitudes about others. He had shared the conversation with Michael and Emma over dinner, watching his daughter's face as she processed the idea that the woman who had hurt them was now helping other families. "Do you think she's really different now?" Emma had asked, her teenage wisdom already emerging at age 11. David had considered the question carefully. "I think she learned something from hurting us. Whether that makes her a different person, I don't know. But if she's helping other families avoid what we went through, then something good came from something bad." Emma had nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's what matters. Not whether she's sorry, but whether she's making things better. Now, 3 years after that terrible day at the airport, life had found a new rhythm. Emma was thriving in middle school, confident in her identity and secure in her family's love. She spoke Spanish fluently and without shame, volunteered at the same multicultural center where Karen now worked, and had become an advocate for other adopted children in her community. David and Michael had renewed their vows on the 5th anniversary of Emma's adoption. Surrounded by friends and family who had supported them through their darkest hours, Emma had walked them both down the aisle, proud to be part of a family that had survived hatred and emerged stronger. The legal settlement had funded not just Emma's education, but a scholarship program for children from diverse families who wanted to study abroad. The Martinez O'Sullivan Family Foundation had already sent a dozen young people to experience other cultures, broadening their perspectives and building the kind of understanding that might prevent future Karen Whitfields from causing such harm. They still traveled frequently, no longer intimidated by airports or afraid of drawing attention. Emma collected passport stamps like trophies, each one representing a victory over the fear that had once controlled their lives. She was fluent in 4 languages now, a bridge builder who moved effortlessly between cultures and communities. The day of their ordeal was marked annually, not as a day of trauma, but as a day of triumph. They called it Truth Day, celebrating the power of facts over assumptions, love over hatred, and community over prejudice. Emma always chose how to spend it, and invariably, she chose activities that brought people together across lines of difference. Last Truth Day, she had organized a cultural festival at her school, featuring families from dozens of countries and backgrounds. Students had shared food, music, languages, and stories, creating the kind of understanding that might have prevented Karen's assumptions from taking root in the first place. David had watched his daughter move confidently through the crowd, switching languages as naturally as breathing, connecting with children and adults from every corner of the world. She had grown into the kind of person who made the world better simply by being herself, unashamed of her complexity and proud of her family's unconventional beauty. As the festival wound down and families began packing up their displays, Emma had found David and Michael in the crowd. "Thank you," she had said simply, hugging them both. "For what, Mia?" "For not letting her win, for fighting back, for teaching me that we don't have to be ashamed of who we are." David had felt tears prick his eyes, remembering the terrified 8-year-old who had been ripped from his arms in that airport terminal. That child had grown into a confident young woman who understood both the world's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Karen Whitfield's moment of prejudice had been intended to destroy their family. Instead, it had made them stronger, brought their community together, and created ripple effects of positive change that would continue long after her name was forgotten. In trying to tear them apart, she had inadvertently proven that love, truth, and justice were more powerful than fear and hatred. The airport terminal where their ordeal began had been renovated since then, its harsh fluorescent lights replaced with warmer fixtures, its cold efficiency softened with art and comfortable seating. A plaque near Gate 23 now commemorated the reforms that had emerged from their case. A quiet reminder that progress often comes from pain, and that individual courage can create systemic change. David sometimes stopped to read that plaque when business trips took him through Dallas International. It reminded him of how far they had traveled, not just in miles, but in understanding, resilience, and hope. Emma's crayon drawing of their family boarding an airplane still hung in their home office, a symbol of dreams that had been delayed but never destroyed, love that had been tested but never broken, and a future that remained bright with possibility. Their story had become larger than themselves, a testament to the power of standing up to injustice and the importance of protecting all families from discrimination. But, at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a love story about two men, their daughter, and their refusal to let anyone else's limitations define their limitless possibilities. In the end, Karen Whitfield had been wrong about almost everything. They were exactly who they appeared to be, a family, real, legitimate, and unbreakably bound by love that no amount of prejudice could ever diminish. Emma's tears at the airport had not been cries for help from her captors, but desperate pleas not to be separated from her parents. Her bilingual chatter had not been evidence of confusion or coercion, but the natural expression of a child comfortable in multiple worlds. The truth had set them free, not just from Karen's false accusations, but from any lingering doubts about their right to exist as they were. They were a family, not because others recognized them as such, but because they had chosen each other, fought for each other, and refused to let anyone's narrow vision limit their expansive love. And in a world that often seemed determined to divide people by difference, they had become living proof that families come in many forms, that love speaks many languages, and that the courage to stand up for truth can transform pain into purpose and fear into hope. Their terminal accusations had become a beginning, rather than an ending, launching a journey toward justice that would echo through generations of families who would fly freely because they had refused to be grounded by hate.